If you've been wanting to gain a better understanding of who you are and how to sort out the different things that have happened to you in your life, then you will appreciate this episode of Prayers and Practices. I'll be talking with author Diane Millis. She is going to invite us to recreate our life story in a way that tends gently to the painful parts and invites hope and new life. At the end of our conversation, I will summarize it all and invite you to write your own life-giving story. My name is Christine Jurisich. I am a retreat facilitator and founder of Retreat, Reflect, Renew, a Christ-centered retreat ministry. Dr. Diane Millis is a teacher, spiritual director, author, retreat facilitator, and she's here to talk to us about recreating our stories, recreating our lives with her book, Recreating a Life, Learning How to Tell Our Most Life-Giving Story. Welcome, Diane.
Thank you, Christine. Good to be here.
It's so great to have you. This is a special moment for me because I love your work. It has inspired so much of the way I do my retreats, so much of the way we do our sacred circles. So this is a special moment for me. I'm excited. And I want you to just jump into what this title means, recreating a life. I'm thinking, I'm sure a lot of people are like, yeah, tell me about that. I want to recreate my life. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm interested in what it means to you and to each and every participant, because I think that meaning is going to be quite personal and quite profound. But as a person whose religious tradition is Christianity, it's a story of creation, and it's a story of creation that's ongoing. So that in the moments that we might be tempted to greatly despair, we know that creation continues, that new life is possible. And so that to me is the invitation to recreation is, I believe, the most sacred invitation we receive. And I think of that as an invitation in my heart from the Holy Spirit. So I think different people from different traditions may view the theology of creation differently, but that's the meaning it holds for me theologically.
And I love how you're asking people to write. I love that you use the term life-giving story. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. What do I mean by that? Well, I think most of us know in our gut what's a story that gives us life and what's a story that denies us life or limits us. We can just feel it in our bodies. We hear ourselves telling a story from the past or something current going on in the media, and we can feel if it's just sucking and draining the energy for us, or if it's enlivening and hopeful. And so when I refer to a story as life-giving, I think of that it pertains to us personally, but it pertains to our communities, it pertains to our society, our culture, our world. So there's narratives on all these levels we might explore. And I believe that we're always being called to discern, because creation is ongoing, how God is at work in continuing to call us to new life.
But as you said, there's these narratives. I have so many in my head. And in preparing for this, I was, working even more on your work and seeing some of those narratives I thought I had moved past are still in my head.
Sure.
If you can talk about those and the phantom story that you write about in your book. Tell me about that.
Yeah, they're still in my head too. I think that's the nature of our consciousness. And in fact, what we're learning about our brains is that the negative stuff sticks like Velcro, and the positive, it's like Teflon. So why is that? That's a protective mechanism throughout evolution to protect us from danger. And so we've got to remember those kind of negative things. But when it comes to our stories, we really don't want to remember. I mean, we're no longer, in the midst of the savannah at threat of being attacked by an animal, but yet our brains operate that way, in that they remember and hold the negative, that Velcro kind of thing. And so for us to notice that, I think that's just the nature of one part of our brain, the old part, right? The amygdala. And then we have this capacity for reason and new stories and new awareness. And that's the new part of our brain. And so I think those are always going to be in tension, Christine. I don't think reading any book or any work ever eliminates that. I think it just continues to bring our awareness. This is the reality of our consciousness.
But the storytelling and the writing and going through this practice, it helps so much to reach that life-giving place. So can you talk about, I have to say, you were so honest and vulnerable in the story writing as you go through the story prompts in your book. You were so honest, and it made me feel like I was with a trusted friend in going through this. And it gave the space for me to be honest in my story writing. So I appreciate that. I feel like you're one of my best friends now.
Well, I'm honored. I'm honored. I often
sitting there with me.
I often say to my students, I think that the invitation is to be appropriately vulnerable. You know, I don't know if you remember some of the talk shows back in the late 80s and 90s, the Jerry Springer kinds of things. And that was just, people were being violated. They were asking to disclose just their very guts. And that's inappropriate vulnerability. That's exploitative vulnerability. And so what I tried to model here is, what does appropriate vulnerability look like? And it is risk-taking. It's always taking a risk.
It is.
But as my own spiritual director said to me, she said, I felt, Diane, like you were in a small group, and if you went first and took that risk and entrusted your story to others, that they might do the same. So to model the kind of depth that you're looking for. So that's what I tried to do, was to both scaffold and model what's an appropriate amount of risk without feeling like you're, opening yourself and becoming, totally naked to the other. Because I think there are some stories that are best shared in prayer. There are some stories I don't even share with my own spiritual director. There are some things that are just meant to be shared within the intimacy with the divine.
Right.
So what, I think we're all gauging, how can we bring things, tender things that we hope others will witness and hold and trust with us. That's what becomes healing and restorative, I believe.
Right. And you do it so beautifully. And can you talk about the phantom story, what you talk about in your book, the story, the life you thought you would have had, and the story you had, and coming to peace and integrating all of that?
Yeah. So I heard about the phenomenon of a phantom limb, that those people who have lost a body part often feel as if it's still there. And that was then what inspired this metaphor of the phantom story. And so for me, I experienced a very notable disruption in my life as a girl when my parents divorced. And so after that divorce, I always felt like that part was cut off, but yet it was still there. It was still there, as if the thought of what would my life have been like if my parents had stayed together, and if we had stayed in the town where I was raised and I had lived that life. So that to me became the phantom story. And even as I moved throughout adulthood, it would still resurface, especially in those moments where I was tempted to despair or discouragement. My default would be, oh, if only my parents would have stayed together. If only I wouldn't have had the disruption of having to move to the other side of the country. If only, if only, if only. So I think the phantom story is often the default that we can go to. And so I just had to continue to hold that up. I don't think we try to push it away. I think we try to befriend it and examine it with great compassion, because for all of us, we're going to have phantom stories. We get laid off from our job in our late 50s, we don't have the the potential for what we might have done in that particular career trajectory. That's a painful phantom story for many.
Right.
I look at the war right now in Ukraine. I look at the phantom story those families are going to have from this point forward. It's always going to be there. It doesn't go away.
Right.
But to gain awareness of here's the phantom story, and now here's the invitation to the potential for new life and growth and transformation.
Right, because it's not about just finding a happy ending or finding the
Not at
positive
all.
story in your life or some of those cliches. It's going
Not at all.
deeper than
Just
that.
like with the phantom limb, for
Mhm.
people, it's often they still feel an ache. So
Mhm.
I don't think we're trying to pressure anyone to get over it and get on with it. That is not at all. If anything, I think we're cultivating our compassion for ourselves and for one another. And just, I often talk about story tending. Let's just be really tender
Mhm.
with the anguish and the disruptions we've experienced.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I find I have so much more compassion for myself when I'm sitting down and writing through them. I want you to walk us through a prompt. You have several writing prompts, story prompts in the book.
Yeah.
I'd like you to walk us through one and invite people afterwards to try one and see the riches that can be discovered.
I'd love to, and I'm going to
Mhm.
share one with you. And actually, many of the prompts in the book I developed myself. This one I can't take credit for. This is Larry Smith and his 6-word memoir project. But I love to use this because whether people have never thought about the story they're telling themselves about themselves, or whether they've written memoirs, I find that this is a very evocative, fresh
Mhm.
prompt for folks. So I'll also give you a couple of pictures to go with this, because I encourage participants or my students to, if they don't necessarily think of 6 words right away, maybe there are images that come to their mind from their life experience. So whether it's words or images, I'm going to offer you some images today. So if you notice here with this graphic, we've got not 6, we've got 5, don't we, saplings? And so I often think that as we're reflecting on the lives we live, we may have a sense of certain words to convey our experience. But the life-giving story invites us to discern some things that may not be apparent. So be gentle and patient with yourself as you think of the words to best convey your story at this time. That maybe not all the words are readily apparent. Maybe some are still underneath the soil and haven't yet sprouted out. So they're going to take some time for
I love that. Love that imagery.
Yes. So the first word in my story, in my 6-word memoir, is the word belonging. So I share this picture with you. This is the only picture I have of myself featured with both of my paternal and maternal grandparents, also a beloved aunt and a beloved uncle. This picture is so precious to me. It shows a lot about me. I was a curious, inquisitive kid, and I loved to be at the adult table. It was a punishment to be with other kids at the kids' table. And I felt such a sense of belonging in my family and with the heritage in which I had the privilege of being raised. I also had a great sense of belonging at my Catholic school. And so to find me, you can look for the extra pious one. No, I'm joking. But I'm front and center here, and just loved this container, dreamed of being a teacher, loved the sisters I had and the lay teachers I had, and just the opportunity for the seamlessness between being in church and being in the classroom. That still is such a big part of me. So there was this container of belonging. And then at age 11, my parents divorced. And so I went to my second word, which was longing. And for at least the next 7 years, when we moved from the small town I'd lived in Minnesota to another part of the country, I just longed and longed to be back in that container of belonging, whether it was my school, whether it was living in Minnesota, all of my identity seemed to be ripped and disrupted.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of my life was this longing and search for belonging. So I could spend a lot more time on this, but what I will turn to quickly is my last 4 words, which are the sense of calling and vocation that emerged out of this disruption, this pain, this anguish, which I believe I am called to create spaces for belonging. So I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I went into areas of teaching that I thought would build bridges and connection and restore relationships, because of course I saw the destruction of relationships with my parents. So I wanted to restore, I wanted to increase understanding. So I went into the area of communication studies. I went into the area of family studies. I eventually went into the area of spirituality and spiritual formation in order to create greater spaces for belonging and understanding. So my 6th picture is now me leading a workshop and just witnessing the deep connections, listening, story sharing that I see among participants. Now, one of the things I've been doing lately to build on this prompt, Christine, is to invite people after they've generated their 6 words, is to identify which word among the 6 might be inviting you to unpack or thicken more of your story. And so I know for me, and I'm going to stop my share now. I know for me, the word longing, I don't do much writing about those years, my teenage years. They're very, very painful.
Right.
I've struggled with depression quite seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there are more life-giving stories awaiting me with that word and with that period of my life. So this is another way we can continue to build on this prompt after we have the 6 words or the 6 images.
Mm-hmm.
Then to say which of these words, which of these periods are inviting greater attention to thicken the stories we're telling about them.
Right. I also like that you say to just write for 15 minutes when you're doing this, that I can get caught up in feeling overwhelmed with, I don't know what I want to, how deep I want to, if it feels so painful. I mean, I'm thinking about journaling the loss of my son 4 years ago. And I think, oh, what do I want to get into? How long, in some of these prompts, but your 15 minutes gave me such a pathway to, or I don't know if that's the right word, but such a space that felt like, okay, this is doable. I'll just write and see what comes out. So can you talk a little bit about
I'd love to. And here again, I can't take credit for the 15 minutes. I drew from some of the best practices, the psychologist James Pennebaker, who's done a great extensive research, especially on folks who have experienced trauma, significant loss like yourself. And well, like all of us, I actually don't know a person who hasn't experienced some type of loss. And he found that 15 minutes is the just right amount. Less than that, it's hard to get into any kind of depth of reflection. And he found that after 15 minutes, that people may start self-editing, or the critic kicks in, or maybe they become engulfed by the pain and the trauma. And so he did a number of different experiments over time, and it seemed that 15 minutes was the sweet spot.
Yeah, I found that to be really helpful. And what is also interesting about this is that you are inviting us to like 2 practices. I mean, one, the storytelling, which is so rich and beautiful, and that third, kind of looking at things as some of them a third person.
Yeah.
Write your story as a fairy tale. I love that one.
Yeah.
That really helps. But there's also the second practice of then sharing it, listening, trying to find this where God is in the story from what you're saying and then from what others are saying as they listen to you. So
Yeah.
we can talk
Yeah.
about that part of the practice.
Yeah. Yeah. So all of this has to do with bearing witness. So how do we bear witness to our own lives? You know, when we look at ourselves, there's a teacher of leadership, Ronald Heifetz, and he invites leaders, let's go up to the balcony and watch what's happening on the dance floor. And I think this is what we can do when we're reflecting on our story. Let's go up to the balcony and look at ourselves as a character in our story.
Right.
So often we get, you know, we get so tied to the way we've been telling something, we lose perspective. So what if we were a character? What if we're witnessing ourselves as a character among other characters? How does that help us to see more or see something new, to find alternative stories? So we're learning to bear witness to our lives. And that's where it helps to also have one or more listeners. As I say in the book, as we talked about, Christine, we need a community to tell our most life-giving story, because we can see aspects of ourselves we often miss, or hear new things that we've been saying, but hear it in new ways. And so they're bearing witness. And what we know, going back to trauma and healing, what we know is we need a safe place and we need others to bear witness in order to help us grow to integrate these devastating experiences that we've had.
Right.
So that's the bearing witness. And I know we're going to talk about the process I've introduced. I'm really trying to make it very accessible, where it doesn't require training as a therapist, just some very simple ways of responding.
Right. Tell me about those prompts. I like those prompts. They're very non-threatening, non-judgmental. You're not getting in someone's story. We're
not there to interpret. That's right. We're not there to
unpack. So talk about those, right?
Yeah, inviting the other person to move deeper into the experience of their story. So there are just three possible responses. I noticed, I appreciated, I wondered. In my training as a spiritual director, it's all about noticing. So often, you know, we go through life and it's just the bright lights in big city that seem to catch our attention because we can't help but notice it. But what about the more subtle, quiet beauty, truth, and goodness? And so this is what we're doing for one another, is to just notice the less obvious parts of the story, to notice what is it non-verbally is happening for the other person. What seems to make their eyes come alive or their eyes move to tears? What about the tone of their voice? What are the particular words they use that seem to have particular meaning just for them, or they use the word in such a way that there's something very significant about that word or that phrase? So these are all things that as we listen to one another, we can make mention of and notice. We can also notice what stirs our hearts as we listen to another. Right. And sometimes that's very helpful. You know, if I heard you talking about the loss of your son, to how much my heart ached to hear that. So what the stirring is within us may be something we also might want to name. So that's the first, the noticing, both the content and the nonverbal. And then the appreciating is the second. I believe there's something to be learned from every person's story. So often we learn as much about our own story by listening to another story as we do telling our own, right? And so what did we learn about the story? I appreciated when, I just got off a conversation with a directee, And she was showing me a picture she just got from a magazine, and she sent it to me after our session. And I appreciated what I could learn from hearing the meaning that picture had for her.
Mhm.
And so that's an appreciation I might convey of how important her honesty and her vulnerability was. And then finally, a wondering is, what's a question that I'm holding that I have no idea what the answer is, but I'm wondering about, I'm curious about. And so I offer that wondering. And if that's something you feel drawn to say more about, it invites you to thicken the story to unpack it.
Mhm.
So those are 3 ways, and all of these ways keep us from projecting our own stuff onto the other, our own interpretations, or taking away, so often we don't want to share our most tender stories because people, what do they say? They're not a good listener. They say, oh, well, something like that happened to me too.
Right.
And then we feel hijacked. And so the noticing, the appreciating, the wondering keeps our attention on the person who's sharing the story. So
Gets
that
away from the fixing.
goes away from the fixing, the interpreting. We want to invite them to move deeper into the soil of that story, where more and more life is waiting to be revealed.
Yeah, it is a beautiful process. So, such a life-giving process. I'm wondering what's coming to me is I'm wondering there's so much trauma that's been suffered over the past few years with the pandemic, a lot of traumatic loss, a lot of traumatic stress and questions, civil unrest, so much. I'm wondering how soon is too soon to sit down and write about your story. If it's fresh and raw, if someone is just feeling, yeah, just fresh and raw, what do you say to that?
There are different schools of thought on this, as you probably will know, Christine. And I remember reading the writing teacher William Zinsser a number of years ago. He teaches about memoir writing. And he and others believe, it takes a decade or more. One memoir writer would say 20 years to gain perspective or to tell a coherent story. That's not my particular belief, although that may be true, that the story will thicken and deepen and continue to be open to new creation and truth. I believe if we feel drawn and invited to explore something in writing, then follow that draw. Because for me, when I'm feeling drawn to something, not driven, but when I'm feeling drawn to something, I believe that's the invitation of the spirit. And so I would follow that. I also think it really helps to have, in addition to the writing one might do, to have one or more conversation partners to process the story with.
Right.
Through what we talk about in the book, through the appreciating, the wondering, the noticing. That's a very tender way of moving into the depth of the story. So if we think of any story, especially during these difficult times, is like a seed, a sapling, and it's just beginning to take root and grow. And I think the more that the accompaniment of others can help shine some light, right, that begins to grow and it begins to flourish. And I think that too then builds the resiliency within the heart of each person speaking. But there's no rush to have it take a certain shape. I mean, I also think very much from the Christian tradition, which is my tradition, a lot of stories we are stuck in Holy Saturday. We've had the death on the cross. We're not yet ready for the new life of Easter. We're just there. We're in the tomb. We're trying to make meaning of the trauma, the difficulty. And so a lot of the work that I do as a spiritual director, a lot of the work I see happening in retreats is where people are meeting one another in that tomb. And there's no rush to figure out how to tell the life-giving story. I think having others bear witness to stories is what slowly offers greater meaning, right? So
I agree. I can't agree more.
yeah, the psychologist Dan McAdams said, and he does a lot on the role of narrative and how it affects our identity. He says we learn to tell a redemptive story through the telling. We don't figure it out cognitively. It's through the telling. It's through the reflective writing, and it's through others bearing witness.
Yeah, I don't know how we can get through life without having each other. We need each other in this loving, safe, sacred way to get into new life, to get into an Easter place. I don't know any other way to do it. And you are giving the tools to do it, because I love that, as you say, there's always recreating taking place. And there's always more life to discover in our stories. And we can just keep visiting and revisiting and see there's so much hope. There's so much healing that can be done. And so that it is such a helpful invitation to enter into the stories that people have that may seem scary to enter into, may seem just too painful to have to sit down and get a pen and a paper. But the tools that you have in the book, the prompts, the time limit, your tone, your voice in the book, it does help give this gentle, loving invitation. And that's how we can get to Easter, as you said. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
When I first started doing this work, I talked about we're mining the meaning. We're not trying to excavate, right? This isn't something we muscle up to do to figure out. It's not the work of our ego. It's a very gentle unearthing and tending and providing those kind of the nourishment that the soil of our lives and the roots of those new stories so want, right? Especially when we're in the darkness of the struggles.
Right. Right. Because I'm thinking, oh gosh, that can be me getting into the ego part of like, I'm going to figure this out and heal.
Sure. Oh, of course. Because
I need to control this. Great.
We want to move on, don't we?
Yeah. So I appreciate that reminder of just tending to it and just gathering the people who can help you tend through it. And I'm hoping that you can read your Howard Thurman prayer. I will sing a new song that is in your book. It's such a beautiful way to sum up what we've been talking about today.
Yeah. So I had mentioned in the book, I tell the story of how I prayed this prayer, especially throughout one Lenten season. It was back in 2016. And I just was really tired of this phantom story and this kind of limited perspective. And so Howard Thurman, theologian, preacher, spiritual director to so many in the civil rights activists. He lived from 1899 to 1981. He gave me the words that helped me live into this life-giving story. So I've adapted from his prayer, I will sing a new song. I've adapted it to I will tell a new story. The old story of my spirit has wearied itself out. It has long ago been learned by heart. It repeats itself over and over, bringing no added joy to my day or lift to my spirit. I will tell a new story. I must learn a new story for the new needs. I must fashion new words born of all the new growth of my life, of my mind, of my spirit. I must prepare for new storylines that have never been mine before, that all that is within me may lift my voice unto God. Therefore, I shall rejoice with each new day and delight my spirit in each fresh unfolding. And if I pray this with a group, we end by saying, we will tell this day a new story unto the Lord. I believe we're being invited to co-create a new story, not only personally, but within our society. And Thurman is one of the best people to lead us in that effort.
Absolutely. I'm just sitting with that. Beautiful. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Diane, I'm honored for you spending this much time with me and to share your work. Thank you for your work. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. It makes me delighted that the months I devoted, the years I devoted to writing these things, that it makes me delighted to see the appreciation and impact it can have on others. That's what any author hopes for.
Good. Well, God bless you and your continuing to find the riches in your life-giving stories. And may we all just continue to allow ourselves to enter into those gentle, tender spaces to continue to find the riches and find the life-giving stories that are deep within us. They absolutely are. Thank you. I invite you to write your own story now. Here's a summary with the prompt Diane shared. As you listen to your life, what 6 words convey your story? Write for 15 minutes with no filters, no judging yourself. Afterwards, notice if a phantom story appears. That's the life you thought you should have versus the life you are living. You may also want to identify which word you want to unpack more. And then share your story with a trusted friend using the prompts, I notice, I appreciate, I wonder. Learn more about Diane's book and all she has to offer on her website. As I mentioned earlier, Diane's work on listening and sharing has inspired our Sacred Circle groups. These sessions focus on holy listening. They're on Zoom twice a month. Visit Retreat, Reflect, Renew for more information. And thank you for watching. I hope that you will click the subscribe button so you can watch our next Prayers and Practices video. Thank you.